Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition here of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host, Christopher Shepard. Happy Thursday to you all, and on this splendid Thursday afternoon, we should have another great show for you. Starting off with some Week 15 prop bets in both Sunday and Monday slate of games, some key injury updates that might affect your fantasy playoff first round decision making, making some of my picks for the biggest games of the NFL weekend, doing my final positional rankings of this first week of the fantasy playoffs with my defense and special teams units to look out for, and last but not least, concluding with more NFL awards race check-ins with my offensive player of the year betting odds for you. Some guys who are in the MVP race but are looking to win a more realistic award because of the fact that the MVP is a quarterback award, as we all know, of course. But before we get into this fun stuff, let me just remind you, if you want to view more content such as this or more exclusive short content throughout the shows and networks here, consider liking, following, and subscribing to both my show or other shows around the network, as well as the network itself. But if you want to do something a little bit more directly to contribute and interact with the show, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. A great way, as always, to interact with the show at large, get your opinions out on air. As always, it just makes the show that much better, that much more interactive, and really gets you, my faithful audience, involved. But without further ado, let us jump right into our first segment of today's show, talking about some more prop bets for this exciting weekend of football here. A lot of intriguing games, not just on the Sunday docket, but Monday night as well. And so I decided to draw from a deep pool of these games in order to find certain players who I think can hit certain prop bets for you this weekend, whether in a positive sense or a negative sense. Because right now, every single team, no matter what their record, has something exciting about it. One aspect that I believe can accelerate their fan base. And so, whether or not your team is in the doldrums right now, contending for a playoff spot, or firmly in the Super Bowl contender status, feel like this week is just a fun week if you're a bettor, because you can have a devil-may-care attitude about certain games and just bet for betting's sake. So, I hope to reflect it in my segment as always. So without further ado, let us jump right into my Week 15 props that you should potentially choose to bet upon. Starting off with a quarterback one in one of the biggest games of the NFL weekend in the late window slate. Steelers-Eagles. Let's talk about Russell Wilson. A lot of people can't make really heads or tails about his start as a Pittsburgh Steeler. He does have a 6-1 record, and he's proven that he can make big plays in this offense. This offense looking much more thrilling than they have in recent seasons under the Mike Tomlin era, whether it be because of offensive coordinator ineptitude with Matt Canada or not. Now they look like they're a competent offense with Russell Wilson at the helm. But I do believe that there are some limitations that come with Russell Wilson's game, and in this matchup against another great defense, in both the run game and the pass game, and the Philadelphia Eagles, who can really disguise coverages, will really test Russell Wilson's deep ball ability and try and generate as much pressure as they can on him to prove that he's no longer the dual-threat quarterback he once was in his Seahawk years. I do think he's going to hit the under in terms of passing yardage in this one. It's going to be a low-scoring game at that, as well as I've talked about through this week. So I'm going to say under 210.5 pass yards in this matchup for us. It's not an indictment of him. I still think he can do enough for the Steelers offense to where they can be competitive in the postseason, as well as in this torrid stretch of football that they have to play on the stretch. They have to play the Eagles now and the Steelers Christmas weekend. So look for this team to have a kind of scary run ahead, and it's going to be tough for the Steelers team to try and win as many games as possible. But I think that Russell Wilson, even though he's not necessarily as much of a big play threat as he was in his Seattle years due to his lack of mobility, more and so now than back then, look for him to kind of be limited a little bit in what he can do, big play-wise for this offense in certain games down the stretch, and maybe even in the postseason. And let's talk about another player in a more positive light, truly coming into his own in his second year in the National Football League for this Minnesota Vikings squad. Let's talk about Jordan Addison. Let's talk about his skill set in this Vikings offense, because he truly has become someone that has really helped Sam Darnold in his downfield passing, because that's one aspect of Sam Darnold's game that we know he's going to want to hit on more often than not, week in, week out, and that is the downfield passing game. And Jordan Addison has been a true bright spot in that regard over these last couple of weeks and throughout the season, for that matter, for Sam Darnold. So I'm going to say he hits his over in that Monday night game against the Bears, 53.5 receiving yards, because, in all honesty, against these weaker defenses, the Falcons last week, the Bears this week, these two guys can feast. And I feel like, even though the schedule might tighten up down the road for Minnesota, and they're going to be more telling games that they're going to have to play, getting both of these weapons going, but against the Bears, I really feel like they can wreak some havoc yet again and have this be a very productive day, even fantasy-wise, for you in your first round in the fantasy playoffs, should you have one or both of those guys. And so that's why I really think Jordan Addison can have a special run these last couple of weeks in terms of what he can mean this Minnesota Vikings offense and their push for potentially the number one seed overall in the NFC, should that matchup in the last week of the season against Detroit really mean that. And so that's why I'm looking at Jordan Addison now as a player who's only going to ramp up from here. And if what we saw from that Falcons game as a harbinger of things to come, then I do feel like Jordan Addison's going to become a popular betting prospect in the weeks ahead. Now let's talk about another player who, make no mistakes about it, might just be the MVP of this league if you really get down to hard tacks and disregard position, Saquon Barkley. And we'll talk about him a lot throughout this show. I do believe that Saquon Barkley is going to be the end-all be-all for the Eagles in the stretch run, both towards the end of this regular season and in the postseason as well. We can see it now, where it's become much more of a run-heavy offense, and Jalen Hurts simply does not necessarily have the passing prowess right now to really elevate that passing game. So we're going to see a lot more of Saquon Barkley in this stretch run. Whether or not it makes this Eagles offense a little bit more one-dimensional, we'll have to see. But I do feel like Saquon, in a matchup that's going to be defined by the play in the trenches, is going to have a huge say in it. And this is the kind of game you're going to have to win if you're Philly in the postseason against a team like the Steelers with a dominant defense. Maybe there are not that many tough defenses on the NFC side of things, but you're still going to have to find ways to grind out wins in the postseason no matter what, just because of what certain defenses on that NFC side of the bracket can do to you. And so Saquon's going to have to prove that he can carry the load should Jalen Hurts continue to underwhelm in the pass game, because it's going to get much more tough in the postseason than you think for the Eagles. And if they're truly to be considered Super Bowl contenders, I feel as if he's going to have to stand up. I was going to comment here from Blurby. Welcome to the chat, my man. Pick one. Cincy McCormick, DeAndre Swift, or Zach Charbonnet, a running back this week in a PPR league. And then pick two in terms of wide receivers. Jacoby Myers, Keenan Allen, Deebo Samuel, and Ferguson or Andrews. I believe we should go with Charbs if KW is out. And I would go with that as well in that regard as well. I think Zach Charbonnet, in some ways, is kind of the better back in terms of reading things at the line. Sometimes Kenneth Walker gets a little bit too fancy at the line, makes the wrong cut, makes the wrong read sometimes, and as a result, slows down the running game. Zach Charbonnet, for that matter, yes, he's not as big of a home run hitter as I would like to think Kenneth Walker is, but he does get the job done in Kenneth Walker's absence when need be. So I would pick Charbonnet in that regard as well, because both Cincy McCormick and DeAndre Swift, let's be real, are in very tough situations right now. In terms of your wide receiver, this is an interesting one because I feel like None of these guys have really proven they can separate themselves from the middle tier of wide receivers, even though a lot of talent are in these three guys. But if I look at the matchups, I do feel that Debo tonight could have a decent game. I feel like in the open field, he's going to get a lot done, get a lot of targets in the open field for San Fran tonight, and I feel like he can finally have an effective game in that offense. But then again, if you want a little bit more upside, then potentially Jacoby Myers. But I really don't know how that offense will look with Desmond Ridder at the helm down the stretch. And then your tight end situation, I feel like Andrews is the answer, because Ferguson has been such a disappointment these past couple of weeks, and Mark Andrews has really come alive these past couple of weeks. So that's perhaps the easiest decision. Then you also mentioned, if Walker does play, do I go Sincere? It's a tough decision there, but I do think out of both of McCormick and Swift, Sincere is the guy to go with, just because I feel like he can get a lot more carries now that Ridder is at the helm at quarterback. So make of that what you will. But just to go over for my final two prop bets here, Geno Smith in that game against the Packers, I do feel it's going to be a run-first attack there to try and keep the ball out of Jordan Love's hands, get it into whether it be Charbonnet's or Kenneth Walker's. And then I feel like Brock Bowers, speaking of Raiders, in that game against the Falcons where they could potentially look a little bit more lively on the offensive side of the football against that weak Falcons pass defense, considering how Desmond Ridder plays, I do think he's going to hit the over as well at 62.5 receiving yards. But to conclude this segment, just going over some final things Blurpy mentioned, only thing I'm worried about is starting Myers with Sincere, but I'd rather go to Raiders than to Bears. Funnily enough, I do agree with you, even though both of these teams are terrible. And thank you for your comments as well. Keep them coming if you so choose. But we do have to take a short break, and when we come back, talking about some key injuries that might impact your first round fantasy playoff decision making in this matchup. So we'll be right back after this short break to talk about it.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign.